I love the interruptions of God, and God just um, when you actually pray, "Your kingdom come, Your will be done, not my will but Yours be done," and all of that, you never know how God is going to answer that prayer. And so, 2013, I love that you said 6 years ago. You mentioned that the direction, your path, changed 6 years ago. So it was the same for me. And 2013 was the turning point. Both my wife and I, we were newly married. 2011 we were married. 2013 we were both without jobs, in a city where you can't afford to stay long without jobs. And we had just been married for a year, and we spent the entire year 2013 without jobs, and we spent most of that year apart from one another. And it obviously strengthened our marriage, but we didn't realize at the time that God was doing something very special in us. So I spent around 6 to 9 months of that year in Bangalore. And I'm not from Bangalore, I'm from Calcutta, but Manisha, my wife, is from Bangalore, and I ended up going to Bangalore. And that's where I went. I ended up walking to the church where she got saved. And that's how I heard Pastor Ashish Raichur for the first time. And I got a hold of his book, which he was giving out. I mean, he's incredible in terms of having his books available for free download on his website in multiple languages, and also hard copies of his book that he would just give out for free after every service. And I picked up this book, two books. The first book that I picked up was Kingdom Builders. It was titled Kingdom Builders, and the rare side of the book, the words I read there blew me away. And the words that I read there was, God has not called you to build your church or your ministry. God has called you to build His kingdom. And it went on to say a lot more, but that, just the rare cover of the book, what I read there got me. And I obviously devoured the content of the book. I mean, you can imagine what the content of the book was like if that's what the rare cover says, right? And to see that coming from a pastor, to hear a pastor say that and write that book was just incredible for me. And I got to meet other pastors in the city that I was incredibly blessed by. A church called Grace Chapel, and another pastor by the name of Michael Verghese. And I got to hear from him. And just casually, he mentioned how Pastor Ashish, when Pastor Ashish anonymously, or just had made a donation to his church, or sent him a check when he was just starting out. And when I heard that from Pastor Michael about Pastor Ashish, I was like, wow, you don't hear testimonies like that, where you're starting a church in the city and you're receiving a check from other pastors in the city, just to bless you, and as a token of honor and a token of. So I was like, wow, in my 16 years as a believer, coming from a Hindu background, I've seen more conflict and division, the whole Pepsi versus Coca-Cola spirit in between churches and in churches and between denominations. And so for me, hearing a testimony like that was like a breath of fresh air. I just continued learning, and continued just receiving so much wisdom and insight and inspiration, not just from a message or a sermon, but from the lifestyle. And I could tell that it just encouraged me to know that, wow, there are people who are walking the talk. There are people who are living this thing out, and that building church is different from building kingdom. And so I know that there are different kinds of leaders who will be listening into our conversation today. There are the fact is that there are leaders who are consumed by fear and insecurity. There are leaders who are masking questionable motives, and that happens in every sphere of life, in every be it in politics or in business, or in every profession. There are doctors who are who are ethical, there are doctors who are unethical, and so on, lawyers and so on. And it, it's it's no surprise that that happens in ministry as well. There are leaders who make questionable decisions, masking questionable motives, sometimes saying all the right things, but the walk doesn't match the talk. And sometimes leaders who fall into the trap of partnering with the spirit of fear and insecurity and self-preservation and all of that, and that hijacks their decision making. But then there's this other group of sincere, well-meaning leaders, uh, some young, some not so young, who are asking themselves the hard questions, like Francis Chan, who went through a journey where he was asking himself some hard questions after the church that he started in his home became a mega church, and he was saying, wait, why does my church not look like the Book of Acts? And he made the bold decision of stepping away from his mega church and launching a house church movement. Individuals like that, and Francis Chan obviously is a well-known name, but I believe there are many other young people around the world, across continents, who are wrestling with this question, and especially in a post-COVID world. Something that you and I were speaking about yesterday was that what COVID-19 and the coronavirus aftermath and the fallout from the crisis, the economic fallout, as well as the immediate impact on churches and gathering and so on. What the virus and what the fallout from the pandemic has exposed is that there has been this unhealthy over-reliance, unhealthy reliance on the building, unhealthy reliance on the church building, and it's almost like the church globally feels crippled, like, oh my goodness, how are we going to operate? How we're not going to be able to gather? How do we do what we do? And people talk about the new normal when in fact for the first a few centuries of church history, they didn't have buildings. They went house to house. So while people are using the term new normal, well, it was normal for them in the first century and the second century too, with church like that. And so I believe there are some sincere, well-meaning leaders who are asking themselves the question, have we been doing things wrong? What does seeking the kingdom first look like? How can I continue building in a way that reflects the king and the kingdom? How can I build in a way where I'm not idolizing the building, but I'm building the kingdom, and I'm actually carrying and imparting a kingdom mindset. I remember in your sermon last year, you used this amazing. You mentioned, you used the statement that stuck with me, and that line from your message back in 2017 was, there is something bigger than church, it's called kingdom. And I will not forget, Andy, I remember in the megachurch where I served, I heard many times the pastor in the main sermon, in the main message, say very, very passionately and very, very almost aggressively from the pulpit that there are some so-called people who talk about kingdom mindset, kingdom mindset. The church and the kingdom are one and the same thing. The kingdom is the church and the church is the kingdom. There is no difference between the church and the kingdom. But then I hear, after that, obviously, I heard other famous ministers from different apostolic leaders from different parts of the world who said the opposite, that the church and the kingdom are not one and the same thing. They are different. The church is just one expression of the kingdom. So yeah, just your thoughts on that. I know I've shot too many questions at you, but yeah, I just want to hear you, man, on that.
Okay, I'll try to take pieces out of what you just said and try to address some of the more pertinent aspects of your concerns that you just communicated. Whether I put it in the same sequential order in which you presented it is another story, but I'm going to try to at least identify some very, very pertinent issues. Let me kind of go back to when you said that the church in its original form was not concerned about buildings, was not too caught up with the institutionalized forms that we have grown so attached to today. And that's the truth, because the first 300 years of the church saw an entity that was so dominant, so strong, so clear, so fixated on purpose, so Christ-centered, so unified in their objective, so completely clear in their mission and mandate. Nothing was blurring, nothing was distorted. It was a church that was ferocious in every way. There was no barriers, there was no obstacles. Now, that was not a church that was completely void of obstacles and void of resistance. The church in the early days, it was overrun with opposition, overrun with persecution. It was constantly under attack, whether it be from the political entities, whether it be from other savage, barbaric entities. The church was constantly under a severe dimension of persecution. But it was interesting that despite all of the external resistance to this movement that started by Jesus, and that's a very important term that we have to hold to, because the church in the beginning was described as the way. So this was a movement. So despite all of the opposition to this ferocious juggernaut that we can call a movement, the church never slowed down, never stopped in its effort, was never deterred in its objective. It was never taken off course from its mandate, never drifted in any which way, despite the consistent barrage of external resistance to its efforts. You know when the church eventually slowed down? In 300 AD, in the days of Constantine. The moment institutionalized church became the norm, what external resistance failed to do, man seeking power and man seeking clerical terms and man seeking ecclesiastical office and man hiding behind bishopric and titles, that slowed it down. In other words, the greatest resistance of the church and its efforts to enforce the purpose of God in the earth, it has never been external resistance. It has always been an internal corruption. Something within the system that causes the average believer to suddenly want to gravitate to titles and power and pyramidic forms. That is far more corrupting than external resistance from barbaric entities. Put it this way, the biggest obstacle to the church is not an external devil, it is an internal ego. The biggest obstacle to the church arriving to its objective is not an external opposition, it's an internal motivation that is not consistent with the mandate allocated to God. So yes, the church in its original form was very clear. Buildings was not an issue. The moment ecclesiastical systems came into play in 300 AD, and there was this gravitation towards buildings and titles and offices, we began to drift away. And since then, we have not been able to capture the energy and the power that we had before 300 AD. Now, that is what led to all kinds of reformation. We could talk about the Zwingli, we could talk about the Calvin, we could talk about the John Husses of this world, we could talk about Count Nikolai von Zinzendorf, we could talk about Luther, we could talk about all of these major reformers, and each of those Reformation initiatives was nothing more than the effort of the Lord to pull the church back into an orbit of authenticity, to pull the church back into an orbit of accuracy. Are we anywhere close to that intent? Maybe we are, not necessarily being represented in what I call the smoke screen that presents itself as church today. Most of what people define as church is born out of the models that are very apparent in front of us. But I want to assure you that most of what we think is church is a smokescreen. The truth is what lives behind what is currently apparent. There is an almost underground, like a city within a city, like a Zion deep inside of the immediate structures that is truly the essence of what the genuine ecclesia is supposed to be. It is almost like God saying to Elijah when Elijah said, I'm the only one left. In other words, Elijah in that regard almost represents the one that is most apparent. And God said, no, there are 7,000 others that you don't see, you don't know. They are not on your Christian televisions. They don't have the mega churches, but their hearts are pure, they are sincere. And so, yes, there is some effort of authenticity taking place, and there are true models existing in the midst of all the foolishness and the morass. There are true models, but they may not be the ones that you are seeing on Christian TV and the ones that are populating our magazines, etc. That's a different dynamic altogether. So that's the first point I want to identify. The other assurance I want to give to leaders is this: despite the prevailing sense of insanity that you see being evidenced within the church in its current form, the purpose of God has not missed a single beat. It is still very much on course, very much on time. When Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, despite the pyramidic forms, despite the ecclesiastical forms, despite man's gravitation to titles and offices, etc., the purpose of God continues to move across the earth like a hot knife through butter. And so don't lose heart. Don't feel as though this thing is about to derail into a failed dawn. This thing is moving dynamically to one powerful conclusion, which is a church victorious and all the kingdoms of this world being assigned to the kingdom of his God and of his Christ. At the end of this whole process, God wins. And that's how this thing will go at the end of it all. To get back into some of the critical questions that you've asked in terms of church and kingdom, let me again pull this thing back into another realm. When Jesus said, I will build my church, a lot of what passes for church today is completely contrary to what Jesus said he wants to build. What we have today is a puerile, punitive, complete distortion of what God initially intended. Sorry to say that to some of you persons who are looking at this, but this could very well be a very disruptive conversation, because a lot of what passes for church is what I describe as an anti-God model that is more Babylonian in its form and less kingdom in its operation. Church in its current form is a clear and present danger to anything that God wants to do on this planet, because it is too religious. It is too concerned about non-essentials. It is too fixated on money. In most places, church is nothing more than an economic model. It is designed to sustain a few at the top and less concerned about the people that are being gathered and pointed to a place of power. During this current COVID-19, a lot of things were exposed. It is sad that in the middle of a global pandemic, some leaders are more concerned about their personal needs, about maintaining the building and making sure the rent is paid, while people's lives are literally falling apart. Which and how many leaders were more concerned about those members that are left high and dry in the midst of a severe pandemic where families were lost, jobs were lost, economic fallout, etc.? The church in its current form has to literally reinvent itself. We have to hit that restart button in order for us to really begin to effect and bring some level of kingdom influence upon the planet. Now listen to this. Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia, not this current form. As a matter of fact, Jesus was not fixated on building a church as we know it. As a matter of fact, the word church and the concept of church as we know it did not come into our vocabulary until about 170 AD. It did not exist. When Jesus said, I will build my church, that word did not exist. The word that was used that is inside of our translation is a word that erupts out of the German language called Kirche, out of which you get the word circus or circle. what passes for church today in the etymology of the word, the original word for church is the very same word from which you get a circus or a circle. Put it another way, exactly what church is today is nothing more than a circus going around in a circle going nowhere. When Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia, that's an entirely different entity altogether. Church is not what he wanted. He wanted ecclesia. Even the original translators, they did us a disservice because they insisted, even the King James translators, they insisted that the word assembly should be removed and replaced with an ecclesiastical model that we still use today called church. The word ecclesia is a different entity. Jesus did not say, I will build my church. He said, I'll build my ecclesia. And the word ecclesia is a serious, serious entity. Back in the ancient times, when Rome will move into a barbaric entity, when, put it in other words, as though they are trying to evangelize a new environment, Rome would normally send about 300 of its best. That will be the best that Rome could possibly offer, together with an individual who will act as a governor. So let's assume that location X is a barbaric entity. Rome moves into location X and they send an individual who will act as a governor. Together with that governor will be 300 of the best that Rome could possibly produce. Men and women, thinkers, philosophers, ideas, people who could produce ideas, who could contribute meaningfully to the formation of a society. Now, that one governor and the 300 of the best that Rome can produce, it is what was traditionally known as an ecclesia. This was not some religious entity. This was not a bunch of people clapping hands and lifting their hands and going through a whole Christian gymnastic exercise. This was a ruthless, nations transforming entity that was designed to bring a level of amelioration, a level of transformation, a level of impact and redemption upon any uncivilized society. And this is the question we have to ask. To what extent does the current kirke or circus or circle reflect the patterns that are deeply embedded in when Jesus said, I will build my ecclesia? It is not a religious model that is concerned about punishing and that concerned about sending people to hell, concerned about cutting people off at the knees, neutralizing people's calling, reducing them to sitting in pews, locked inside of a church building and a church service for 2 or 3 hours. This was supposed to be the gathering. The word ecclesia was the gathering of the intelligentsia. And it will sometimes amount to as much as 6,000 people. And they will gather together, sit, consider profound ideas, strategies that will be able to transform the immediate society. The ecclesia, back in its original form, would be actually the ones who would justify and give reasons as to why the nation should go to war. They were like a senate, a present-day senate. This was not the model that we see in front of us today. And so when I say the church in its current form is a clear and present danger to anything that God wants to do, you would understand that the church is not consistent with the ecclesia that Jesus said he wants to build. That takes us into another very important angle. You look throughout the history of the church, and as I said earlier, every time God wants to bring the church right back into an orbit of authenticity, there is always something that we will associate as a move of God. You look through history, every move of God over the last couple hundreds of years started outside the church, not inside. You could look at the Martin Luther movement, which was a radical, transformative reformation. That started by a man nailing 95 reasons why the church is wrong on a university wall. 200 years after, a guy called John and two men called John and Charles Wesley moved across England and Europe, bringing massive, massive change in what we know today as the holiness movement. Those men were kicked out of the church and they went on the streets. The movement of God in 1700 was not in the church, it was outside the church. In the 1900s, a man blind in one eye called William Seymour became the pioneer of the Pentecostal movement. That did not start in the church. He was a black man. He was basically kicked out of the church. That started on a veranda, and the thing began to grow, and they went to a barn. It was not in the structure, outside the structure. William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, that again, he was kicked out of the structure, and he started a movement in a cemetery. The Salvation Army movement started in a cemetery. We could go on and on. In 1949, in Saskatchewan, Canada, we could go on and on. Here is the question. Here's the question. If every single one of these moves started outside the church, what killed it? We pulled it in the structure, and we prayed it to death, we sang it to death, we worshiped it to death, or we preached it to death. Every move of God that God started in the earth started outside. We brought it in and we killed it. That begs a very important question. If all the moves of God started outside, then is it something that God is trying to take us out of these structures? But because we are so loyal to these structures, we took what God started outside, pulled it inside, and literally churched it to death. We buried it in religion, buried it with some kind of humanistic ideology. We buried it in titles and every other thing. And at the end, we were just happy with the emotional stirring that the move of God produced. Today, when you talk about a Pentecostal move, we are more caught up in the emotional stirring. You talk about a charismatic move, we are more caught up in nice songs and melodious worship, and we ignore the fundamental thing that God has always been after. He wants to bring this entity back into an orbit of authenticity and correctness so that he could get his purposes executed in the earth. Very, very important. Moves of God is not some little trophy that we have in a building that is designed to entertain us. What we call a revival in most circles today is a Christian entertainment exercise. It tickles us and gets us all excited inside of a building. I believe one of the best things ever happened to the global church is what is happening right now. This current pandemic, I am really saddened by the lives that have been lost. I think as of now, it's up to over 500,000. The countless millions of lives that have been affected by this issue, the fallout will be enormous, enormous. And so I want to put that caveat inside of there, that my heart goes out to the multitudinous individuals who are being affected by this situation. But in the midst of this carnage, God is literally dismantling this current distortion that is existent in the earth called the church in its current form. And he's beginning to point leaders to think outside of the box. For some nations, as much as 4 months, they could not go into their church building environment. They can't holler and scream and shout at their people unintelligently the way they've done it for years. Because listen, if you're speaking into a camera, you can't go through that religious exercise. I want to tell you today that the Lord, you can't do that. You have to speak differently because this is no longer a bunch of people in front of you when you go through this gymnastics. So this season is really pointing people to think differently, act differently, reset this model, and let's put this entire ecclesia back on a path where God could really accelerate his intentions on a massive level. Now, those are some of the questions answered that you've asked, but we have to pull this thing right back and talk about the issue of the kingdom. Because I'll say this, that the kingdom and church, having said all that I've said before, the kingdom and church are two separate entities. They are not one and the same. Most people step into church and assume that they have touched the kingdom. The reality is that church ought to expose us to what true kingdom life is, but what we have in most circles, church introduces us to religious lifestyle. And it almost like fossilizes our spirit and fossilizes our brain, and we lose sight of the more profound reality called the kingdom. The kingdom in its most basic definition is that realm of God's uncontested rule. uncontested rule. I describe the kingdom as the benevolent home of redeemed humanity. The benevolent home of redeemed humanity. The kingdom is where God expresses his rule without any form of opposition. Now, in the context of my life, it is a matter of God having such absolute control to steer, to guide, to direct, and move my life without the resistance of my own flesh, without the resistance of my own thought, without the resistance of my own ego, without the resistance of my own carnal motivation. Within the context of your life, it's the same. In order for the kingdom to come, then your own carnality must go. Your own rulership of your life, your own handle of your life must go. Hence, the Bible says that if you are a son, as many as are led by the Spirit, they are the sons of God. A son of God is not just the fact, well, I am going to church. A son of God is one who surrenders control of his own life and allow the Spirit to guide and direct. We have to relinquish control in order for God to exercise true dominion in the affairs of our own lives. Now, the kingdom is a broad and dynamic space. Jesus did say that this gospel of the kingdom must be preached in all the earth, and then the end shall come. In most people's minds, we think that once we preach the gospel of salvation, then the end shall come. Those are two different messages altogether. He did not say the gospel of salvation. He said this gospel of the kingdom, the rule of God, the dominion of God, the exercise of God's ultimate rule. And that is not where God is trying to manipulate and control in some inordinate manner the lives of men. It's a matter of man submitting themselves to the rule of God, allowing his dominion to express itself without any form of resistance and operation. Again, that is the succinct version.